The wind in the Texas plains had a way of talking to a man. Sometimes it whispered, sometimes it roared, and sometimes, on nights when the moon was high, it sounded like it was trying to remember a song it once knew. That was the only company Eli Carter had for the last 9 years. He'd once been a trail rider, a cattle hand, the kind of cowboy who'd walk into a saloon and leave with a dozen new friends. But the years had stripped all that away, one bad winter, one lost herd, one tragic moment when a fever took the only woman he'd ever loved. After that, Eli just kept riding until there was nowhere else to go. He built a shack out by the river where the land swelled and dipped like the back of a sleeping giant, and he stayed. Folks from the nearest town stopped trying to bring him into Sunday service. Letters from his brother out in Wyoming went unanswered. The sound of his own voice felt foreign, like an old fiddle left in the attic too long. Days became seasons, seasons became years, and Eli learned to measure time not by calendars but by how the cottonwoods leaned in the wind and how the river ice cracked in spring. He'd convinced himself it was better this way. No hurt, no loss, just him, the land, and the silence. But silence has a way of becoming heavy, like a blanket you can't quite push off. That's why, when Eli saw the plume of dust on the horizon that autumn afternoon, his heart did a strange thing, it stumbled, like it was remembering how to run. He was out mending a section of fence that no longer had cattle to hold when he spotted them. At first, he thought it might be a small band of riders passing through. Then he saw the man at the front, a tall figure in full Comanche regalia, his braids long and dark, the sunlight catching the beadwork on his chest. Beside him, 2 young women rode, their dresses embroidered with patterns Eli had never seen, their faces proud yet cautious. The horses moved slow, deliberate, like they carried the weight of something important. Eli wasn't a man easily startled, but seeing Comanche riders this far out was unexpected. There had been no raids or skirmishes in these parts for decades. This was something else entirely. The lead rider raised a hand in greeting as they approached. Eli hesitated, then returned the gesture. The man stopped just a few paces away, his expression calm but unreadable. "I am Chief Tehano," he said in a voice deep enough to seem carved from the earth itself. "These are my daughters, Ahina and Marai. Our horses have gone lame. We need water, and a place to stay the night." Now, Eli could have pointed them toward the nearest town. Could have said it was too much trouble. After all, it had been years since he'd hosted anyone, and part of him feared he'd forgotten how. But something in the chief's tone, a quiet dignity, a weight that wasn't asking for charity but offering respect, made Eli nod. "I've got water. And a fire that's warm enough for all." He motioned toward the shack. That night, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, Eli listened more than he spoke. The chief told him they were traveling to meet kin in the north, but the journey had been longer than expected. They'd crossed dry stretches with no forage for the horses, and one mare had gone down from exhaustion. The daughters spoke little, but Eli caught glances between them, half curiosity, half caution, as if they weren't sure what to make of the solitary cowboy. Eli, for his part, found himself strangely aware of his own roughness, the wild beard, the patched shirt, the calloused hands that hadn't shaken another's in so long. After supper, the chief offered a small pouch of tobacco as thanks. Eli shook his head. "Don't need payment for a roof and some fire." The chief studied him for a moment, then smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Kindness is the only coin worth keeping," he said. Eli didn't reply, but the words settled in him like a seed finding soil. The next morning, Eli planned to point them on their way. But when he went to check the horses, he saw the problem was worse than he'd thought. The younger mare's hoof was split, the kind of injury that needed more than rest. "She won't make the trip like this," Eli told the chief. "Not unless she's shod and wrapped proper." The nearest farrier was 40 miles east, and the chief knew it. That meant staying longer. Over the next days, something unexpected began to happen. The chief helped Eli repair parts of the shack he'd long neglected. The daughters fetched water, gathered firewood, even cooked meals that carried flavors Eli hadn't tasted since his youth. Laughter, light, musical, began to fill the cabin in the evenings, and Eli felt the silence inside him loosening. He noticed things he'd stopped noticing years ago: how the stars looked sharper after rain, how bread tasted better when made for more than one person, how the sound of voices could make the walls feel less like a cage. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sky fade from gold to indigo, the chief spoke quietly. "You live far from people, Eli Carter. Why is that?" Eli almost laughed. No one had called him by his full name in years. But he found himself answering. He told them about the winter that took his herd, the sickness that took his wife, the way grief had made him smaller until all he could do was disappear. The chief listened without interrupting, his daughters silent but attentive. When Eli finished, Tehano said, "In our way, we say a man who lives alone carries only half a heart. The other half must be found in others, or it withers." Eli didn't respond right away, but the words stayed with him, like a campfire's glow in the dark. Morning came with a sky the color of tarnished silver and a wind that smelled of rain. Eli had learned to read weather like most folks read a newspaper, and this wasn't the kind of storm that just passed by. Out here, when the clouds stacked low and heavy, the river could rise fast enough to turn a quiet evening into a fight for your life. He mentioned it over breakfast, but Tehano only nodded, as if he already knew. The daughters exchanged a look that said they'd seen worse, yet Eli caught the faintest flicker of unease in their eyes. By afternoon, the rain came, not in polite drops but in sheets that slapped the earth like they had a grudge. The river, swollen from days of upstream storms, began creeping closer to the shack. Eli worked with Tehano to move the horses to higher ground, their boots sinking in the mud, the wind cutting like a whip. Marai and Ahina stayed near the cabin, gathering anything that could be ruined by water. It wasn't long before the river wasn't creeping anymore, it was charging. When the bank finally gave way, the sound was like a tree splitting in two. A rush of brown, frothing water poured across the flatland, carrying branches, debris, even the occasional tumble of rock. Eli shouted for the chief and his daughters, waving them toward the bluff behind the shack. "Move! Now," he barked. But just as they began climbing the slope, Eli heard the terrified scream of one of the maras. She'd broken from her lead and was trapped in a low spot, water swirling around her legs. Eli didn't think, he just ran. The cold hit like a wall, the current grabbing at him, but he pushed through. He reached the mare, whispering low and steady, trying to calm her as he fought to untangle the lead from a fallen branch. The water rose to his chest. For a heartbeat, he thought they'd both be swept under. Then a strong hand grabbed his shoulder, Tehano. Together they freed the mare, guiding her toward the bluff. By the time they reached safety, Eli's legs were shaking from cold and strain, but the horse was alive, and that mattered. They spent the night huddled under a makeshift shelter high above the floodplain, the rain pounding like drums on stretched hide. Eli sat wrapped in a blanket, shivering, when Marai handed him a steaming cup of something fragrant. "Tea," she said softly. "From roots we carry. Good for cold." He took it, surprised at the warmth that spread through more than just his hands. For a long time, none of them spoke. They just listened to the storm tear at the world below. When dawn came, the river had receded, leaving the shack half collapsed and the fence lines scattered across the mud. It would take weeks to fix. But as Eli stood there, staring at the wreckage, he realized something strange. He didn't feel the crushing weight he might have years ago. Instead, he felt ready. Ready to work. Ready to rebuild. Ready, maybe, to live among people again. Tehano put a hand on his shoulder. "The river takes, but it also gives," he said. "You saved what you could. That is what matters." Later that day, while helping gather what little was salvageable, the chief told Eli their horses could travel again. They would leave the next morning. That night, they shared one last meal together over the rebuilt fire pit. The daughters laughed as Eli attempted a story he hadn't told in years, a clumsy, half-remembered tale from his trail riding days. Tehano listened with a small smile, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a carved wooden figure, a horse mid-gallop, every detail precise. "For you," the chief said. "To remind you that a man is not meant to stand still forever." When they rode out at dawn, the wind carried their silhouettes into the distance until they were nothing but shapes against the horizon. Eli stood there for a long while, the carving warm in his palm, the sound of their voices still lingering in his ears. He spent the following weeks repairing the shack, not because he wanted to retreat again, but because he wanted a home worth welcoming others into. He rode into town for supplies, spoke to folks he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade, and even found himself joining a neighbor for Sunday coffee. The silence was still there sometimes, but it wasn't heavy anymore. Months later, a letter arrived, not from his brother, but from Tehano. It spoke of safe travels, of family reunions, and of the chief's gratitude for the days they had shared. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a short note from Marai: "When we see kindness, we carry it with us. We hope you do the same." Eli set the letter down, smiling. The seed the chief had planted in his heart had taken root. And somewhere out there, he liked to think the wind carried his name across the plains, not as a man who hid from the world, but as a man who, when the time came, opened his door.